Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Julia Lara. I am also a member of the DC Latino Caucus. I want to thank you for being here. I think this is going to be an interesting conversation rather than a formal forum. We're going to examine the issue of immigration reform from 3 different lenses. We're going to start out with general overview of the bill that was passed by the Senate that is currently sitting in some form in Congress. We're going to talk a little bit about the implications of that bill, the key components of that bill, and why it's important for the Latino community. Secondly, we are going to provide you with an understanding of what has been happening in terms of advocacy, led primarily by the Dreamers. These are young people who are the sons and daughters of undocumented people in this country, and how they have been mobilized, or how they have mobilized themselves to become a strong force in support of immigration reform. And then we're going to hear from our third speaker, who will focus on the issue of immigration reform, the current bill, and the implications for a subset of the community, which would be members of the LGBT community. I like to say that the speakers, I will introduce them individually before they start, but that you hold your questions until all 3 of them have delivered their remarks, so that we can be more efficient with respect to the presentation. And I'd like to, by way of context, piggyback on what was said before by Jerry about the historical context and importance of where we are now, not only for the broader community in the U.S., but for the Latino community. And it's very important for the Latino community to not view the immigration reform struggle in isolation of all of the other things that are important to us, because even if immigration reform were to be enacted tomorrow, that does not mean that the problems that the Latino community and other poor communities in this country will be resolved. And so while we focus on immigration reform now, that's a major priority, we also have to struggle to ensure that we reach statehood in DC, and that issues such as unemployment, poor housing, poor education, all of those other issues that affect us as just residents of this city and of this country, that we struggle to ensure that we improve outcomes in those areas too. So I just wanted to piggyback on that historical context, because I think that sometimes some members of our community forget that there's a broader set of issues that we have to also struggle with. So having said that, let me introduce, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Dagoberto Torres, who is the General Counsel of El Salvador. Welcome. Welcome. Okay, that's okay. Without further ado, let me just read a brief bio sketch of our 3 presenters. And I'm going to read them and present them in the order in which they will address you in their remarks. The first speaker is going to be Abel Nuñez. He is the Executive Director of CARECEN, one of the most prominent immigrant advocacy organizations in DC. Prior to coming to CARECEN, Mr. Nuñez was the Associate Director of Centro Romero in Chicago, Illinois. Mr. Nuñez moved, I guess, from Chicago. Is that what, Senator, moved to Chicago? Is that what you meant to say? I'm sorry. He worked in the DC Latino Civil Rights Center. Is that based in Chicago?
That was here.
That was here, okay, I'm sorry. Just wanted to make sure that I'm reading this correctly. So the DC Latino Civil Rights Center is based in DC. He's worked, that's his experience, he's worked with the center. From 1998 to 2000, he was also at the staff of CARECEN, serving first as its Citizenship and Civic Participation Project Coordinator, and then he later became the Deputy Director. Mr. Nuñez immigrated from El Salvador to the U.S. with his family in 1979 and grew up in the District of Columbia. That's our first speaker. Our second speaker is Josue Salmeron. He is the Grants Program Manager for the Office of Latino Affairs. He has been with the Office of Latino Affairs since 2007. Josue is a certified project manager with many experience working as a project manager in a nonprofit and private, and the private and government sectors. In 2006, when he graduated from Antioch, Josue helped to develop a youth peer educators program. As the program coordinator, Josue trained and mentored 40 youth who now are peer educators. He was raised in Washington, D.C. and graduated from D.C. Public Schools. Our last speaker is Edward Grandis. Edward is an attorney at law specializing in transactional business law. Mr. I don't know what that means. We'll find out. Mr. Grandis is very involved in the community. Some of the community organizations that he's been involved with include the DuPont Circle Merchants and Professional Association, the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, and the DC Immigrant Rights Coalition. He has been a big voice and advocate for DC marriage equality. Mr. Grandis holds a BA from the University of Georgia and a JD from the University of Richmond, and lives in DC with his partner. Thank you. Without further ado, Abel.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Latino Caucus, for inviting me. I'm going to give just a general overview of where we're at with immigration, but I think first, I want to just begin with a little history of how we got here. So, in 2012, we were dealing with an administration that was deporting people at a record level and continues to deport at a record level. Within the movement of immigration reform, we were trying to figure out what our next move was going to be until the elections of 2012, which really set the benchmark that not only did Obama win re-election, but the Latino community played a significant role in that election in several states, which then allowed the movement to say that it was time for immigration reform to happen. So the wheels quickly began moving towards developing a comprehensive approach to that reform. So so it started in the Senate. So there was a famous Gang of Eight that came together, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, that developed sort of this grand scheme of reforming the entire immigration legal structure, not just providing a pathway for legalization for undocumented, but also reforming all aspects of immigration enforcement and other visas available to folks coming in. So that was the conduit. So at the beginning of this year, they began to develop and have hearings, and in June of this year, the Senate passed the famous 744, which was a comprehensive immigration reform that has, one of its major provisions is actually border security. So it increased the amount of border agents that are going to be employed. It also improved the technology that was going to be in there. And in order for this legislation to pass, they actually had to accept about a $40 billion packet that would allow a lot of companies, especially from the defense industry, to be part of this bill in order for us to get a pathway for the 11 million undocumented immigrants currently living, the estimated 11 million living in this country. The pathway is one which is very difficult. So it is a pathway that includes a wait of about 13 years. Most of the 11 million will have to apply for a permit. It's called an RPI status, and what I call RIP really, because they're going to rest in peace, and who knows if they'll get out of it. It'll last for 6 years. They will have to reapply for another 6 years, and after that, they're going to be able to then apply for legal permanent residence. Now, they still have to pay a fine, and I think what we have to realize is the dynamic of accepting immigrants has come one that they have violated the law and they have to pay for their original sin, right? And so the original sin is actually crossing the border without permission. And so as the bill was approved and the deals were cut, unfortunately, it has created a confrontation between both houses, because the House, which is controlled by Republicans, basically stated that they were not going to take the Senate bill, because that's one of the approaches that they can take. One, the House at this moment where it currently lies, the next step of the immigration bill, they could take that bill and then build upon it and approve it so it can go to conference committee. But they said that they were not going to take that bill, that as a matter of fact, that they prefer a piecemeal approach, meaning that they want to take security first, because they feel right now that the border is not secure. And when they mean the border of the United States, they really are talking about the southern border, the Mexico-U.S. border, right? And so that at this moment, as the summer recess began, actually in August, the idea was that a lot of the legislators were going to go back to their districts, check in with their constituents, something that, as you were talking about DC statehood, we don't have, right? So the actual right of citizens to speak to their elected officials, something that currently we don't have in DC, is what the rest of Congress was going to do. And out of that, they were there to come back and figure out what the next step is going to be. Now, there are a couple of factors that are impacting how this moves forward. One, there are huge interests within the immigration movements that are not connected to actual immigrants or immigration. And we're talking about the detention centers that are privatized. It is within their benefit that more people get caught in the net. The people that build the drones that have run out of wars in the Middle East now need to put their hardware somewhere else, and actually the Senate bill provides for having drones flown 24 hours a day for surveillance at the border. And so they have their 2 cents in. And so all of these different entities are pushing against our interest, that what we want is to ensure that there is a fair pathway for the 11 million to go through to become legally, because we believe that they strengthen the U.S., that economically they are fortifying this nation and really bringing new resources to the country. So at this point, I think that there are a couple ways that immigration can be resolved. One, that the House will continue to look at this as piecemeal, and they will address separately border security, they will address the backlogs separately, and they will address the 13 million separately, which include the subgroups such as the Dreamers, which you'll speak about, other groups such as people with temporary protective status, which are large Central Americans that are, Salvadorians, Nicaraguans, and Hondurans, and other groups that are included in that. There is also a gang of 7 in the House. They could come up with their own grand bargain and present that and move that forward and prove it. But I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have moving forward is that we have a very compressed calendar. If we don't get something by the end of this year, it'll be very difficult starting in 2014 to get something done, for the main reason that next year is an election year. And when an election year happens in Congress, nothing controversial passes. And so we have to get something this year or really early next year in order for this to move out of the House, get into conference committee, get reconciled with the Senate bill, and then hopefully it is something that the president can sign. Now, a couple of things. For us, from CARECEN's perspective, we want to ensure that the 11 million have a way to adjust. But the price for that may end up being higher than we're willing to pay. And I mean that in several ways. One, as taxpayers, the Senate bill already has with it a price tag, of just $40 billion of what was added at the end. But also are the challenges that people will have to do to be able to become legalized. We have to remember that within the Senate bill, it is a 13-year wait before they can apply. Within the Senate bill, all 11 million have 1 year to get this permit, to actually register. The Department of Homeland Security has the ability to extend that another 1.5 years, but current experience teaches us that the program for youth, DACA, that Obama signed, if you ever walk by an organization that was providing that service, you saw lines across the block. So just imagine trying to serve 11 million people in a compressed 2.5-year time frame. So there are going to be some issues about actual implementation of this bill to ensure that the maximum amount of people that are eligible actually qualify. Because one of the challenges is that, according to some estimates, about 5 million of the 11 million will not end the process of legalized or permanent residence. Many of them will stay, because this bill is set up that it puts barriers, and it's kind of like a bottleneck. Every year it goes by, we're going to lose people. We're going to lose people because they lose jobs and you have to be employed in order to maintain your status. We're going to lose people because they commit minor infractions. We're going to lose people because they can't afford to stay in the program. Remember, they're going to have to pay. And the example is TPS, temporary protective status. They have now, Hondurans and Nicaraguans, is their 15th year in the program. Salvadorans, their 12th year. And they have paid over $1 billion into the system. So that is what we're asking these people without any of the benefits. The 11 million, once they get into RPI, will not be eligible for the health care, Obamacare. They don't have any access to any public benefits. They don't have any access to loans for school. So their ability to grow and develop themselves is severely limited. What they do have the ability to do is work and provide money to the tax base. So I think that what we have right now is a better opportunity than before. But what we need to see is, moving forward, is the price for getting what we want for the 11 million becomes just too expensive at a moral level, at a monetary level, and at a policy level that will eventually cause the entire process to stop. So I think right now we're hopeful that Congress will resolve something. And I don't think it's going to be the Senate bill, but I think that it's the best opportunity for us to get something than we were maybe a year ago. So I think the news is not as bright as we want to be, but I think that there's still a lot that can be rescued. So I'll stop there, and then maybe we can take the rest of the questions.
Thank you, Abel, and thank you, Franklin, for inviting me to participate in today's panel, and thank you all for coming out on a Tuesday night at the Reef Center. Good evening, I'm Josue Salmeron. As Julia mentioned, I'm the grants manager at the Office on Latino Affairs, and it's a pleasure for me to speak tonight on behalf of the Mayor's Office on Latino Affairs, especially given the issue tonight, the topic tonight. I myself immigrated to this country, so part of a displacement of war. I'm from El Salvador, and my family fled El Salvador and relocated to DC. This was I was brought over in 1990, and many of them came over many years before that. Well, I want to talk a bit about the dreamers, the young people here who are here not by personal choice. They didn't come here themselves, and they have to suffer the consequences of of policy that's happening abroad. I don't like to talk too much about El Salvador because it's still a very bitter experience for both sides, whether they were on the FMLN side or the Arena side. There is no one right in that conflict, and in my family there's still I'll say hatred towards both sides, and I say hatred because many of them were and to this day suffer as consequences of the war. But anyway, moving on. I believe that all individuals have an inherent right to food, water, shelter, and education, and our young people are being deprived of the elemental things that we need to survive. And it is inhumane for any government to link these resources to a legal status, as many states have done, they've tried to do, and I'm sure they will continue to do. But anyway, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys all know this. The Mayor's Office has a long history of being engaged, involved, and supportive of immigrant rights and access to resources available to the general community. With regards to Dreamers, we have supported and invested programs that assist Dreamers. More specifically, we worked with CARECEN just last year and sponsoring workshops that provided information screenings for Dreamers to see what is their eligibility and also help them apply. In my last report that I got from CARECEN, they had filed 302 applications for Dreamers. And obviously one organization is not enough to do this, and as Abel mentioned, that if we wanted to manage 13 million across the country, a lot of them would be left out purely because there aren't enough resources to serve all. And then the other ones are the other group of individuals that are defrauded in our own city. The notaries that are promising to get them papers and all kinds of legal changes in their status, and it isn't true, and many of them fall prey to these individuals just looking for the quick buck. Anyway, so we provided that program just this year. We also secured an additional $200,000 to support youth development with a focus on individuals without a legal status. This is to provide employment and career opportunities. So just this summer, we were able to provide employment and career opportunities to 150 youth. A program that disappeared about 3 years ago when we had significant budget cuts in DC government. We could not support summer youth employment programs for undocumented youth this year. DOES, and now that we were able to secure some local funds to bring some of those programs back. We can't bring it back to the level that we had them, but we were able to serve 150 youth. And I am personally proud to have been involved in this project. That 150 youth could participate in summer programming just like their peers, and just like their siblings. Many of them see their siblings participate in summer youth employment program, and they can't. But this year we changed that for 150, and we'll continue to support programs like such as these. However, our efforts, we're just a small agency with 10 individuals, and we try our best, and with something such as big as working with the dreamers and getting them access to simple things of education, and even in DC, something that, or only university in the district, it is a challenge, and it's beyond our office, and we need everyone's support. And while DACA is a very good option, alternative, it is not a long-term solution, as Abel mentioned, and we need to work towards that. We need to work towards having a permanent solution for dreamers and for their families. And I welcome any opportunities to work with our panelists and everyone in the audience on how I can be involved in that process, how I can get our office involved in that process.
Thank you.
Good evening. As I was introduced earlier, my name is Edward Grandis, and I'm a resident of DC. I am an attorney. My private practice focuses around business, small independent businesses, the ones you see in the 14th and U Street corridor type of thing. What got me involved in immigration was that in 2003, I met my partner, who was mentioned earlier, Juan Dario. He's Venezuelan. And about 6 months after we met in Miami, I convinced him to move to Washington. And we've been together ever since the spring of 2004. After Juan moved to DC, we learned of the difficulty it was for him to replace his valid Florida identification card for a DC DMV identification card. I'm an ignorant person on a lot of these issues, but when you get confronted and you realize that there are ignorant regulations, I hope we all get together and work to improve them. So together we've worked with a lot of people, a number of the people at this table and out here, and it's taken, as you all know, many years since 2004 to get DC to really focus on how we can bring our DMV policies in line with the DMV statute. And we hopefully will see the government, DC government, issuing the same IDs to all our immigrants for driving and for identification as any other resident, hopefully within the next year. On July 31st, 2008, I proposed, and Juan and I got married in West Hollywood, California. During the short time when same-sex marriage was illegal in that state, I saw the handwriting that it wasn't going to be legal long, at least in my feeling, and I said, let's get out there and do something. And we could have gotten married maybe in Massachusetts, but we thought California would need us. Since then, we've resided in DC. Because of that experience, we both became very involved with marriage equality here in DC. We worked very hard with a lot of other people to have the district at first acknowledge the out-of-state marriages of same-sex couples from around the world and other states. And then a year later, we worked hard with other people who worked very hard to get the council to recognize the ability to have same-sex marriage in DC. Now that DOMA has been declared unconstitutional, we are now getting ready to apply. I'm going to apply to the services to sponsor him for a green card. And we're very excited about that. And I think that sort of makes the loop of why I'm here this evening. I'm here to talk to you all about the status of same-sex marriage in the country, particularly how it relates to binational couples, and how DOMA, by the court declaring Section 3 unconstitutional, now has opened up the doors to same-sex binational couples to be treated exactly the same as same-sex, opposite-sex couples. So what I'd like first to do is to briefly, explain that in the United States, we have a federalism-type system. And, these words sometimes don't have real meaning until they hit us in the face. And in this regard, things in the Constitution that are not articulated to be, the powers of Congress or the powers of the presidency, they are reserved to the states. And one of these issues is marriage. So up until 1996, the federal government has never intruded on the definition of marriage in any of the states, and has encouraged what's called comity. It has encouraged this legal process where one state will recognize the marriages of another state, and the federal government will recognize the marriages of all the states. But as you know, in 1996, there was this effort to define marriage at the federal level between a man and a woman. And that process went very quickly. Within less than a year, that statute was written as a bill, went through committees, went through the House, went through the Senate, and President Clinton signed it in a matter of maybe less than 7 months. So if Congress wants to get something done, they seem to know how to do that. Many aspects of marriage law are determined, as I said, by the states. However, in 1972, the Supreme Court, in a case called Baker v. Nation, or Nelson, ruled on the same-sex marriage issue of a party that filed in Minnesota. And the court made a decision then that if the state of Minnesota did not want to recognize same-sex couples, the federal government had no role in making them. So up until recently, until DOMA, the Supreme Court at least seemed to allow states to discriminate based on sexuality. Now, this decision was before Lawrence v. Texas, which was another very famous 2003 decision that was brought to respect what are called privacy issues for sexual relations between two individuals. So, because this 1972 decision was before Lawrence, many people now in the legal community believe that if there is a case regarding marriage rights, as we saw with California, the Supreme Court may take a very different decision, as it did with California. So, in a way, because it's a state-controlled issue, this whole issue is very much at flux in particular states. And what we've seen since DOMA is being declared unconstitutional. Some couples, like in Pennsylvania, I believe, and in Ohio, where they have laws against same-sex marriage, are now challenging their own state in their own state courts. And that's probably one of the outcomes that I think the Supreme Court may have encouraged, to say, look, we've opened the door to California. We hope that people who believe in marriage equality will get active in their own particular state. Now, currently, same-sex marriage is recognized in 13 states, plus the District of Columbia, and by 5 Native American Indian tribes. So, if you look at the population today, about 30% of the United States population already live in jurisdictions where same-sex marriage is allowed. Now, there are 6 other states that have what are called civil unions or registered partnerships. In these 6 states, the legislatures define civil union or registered partnerships to be same as the rights of marriage in those 6 states. So if you add that population of 13% to states where same-sex couples have the same rights in their state as opposite-sex couples, you get to about 43% of the population. So really since 1996, when DOMA went into effect, till now, which is relatively a short time in history, we now have about 43% of the population that live in jurisdictions. And the reason I'm highlighting this before we get right to DOMA and how that plays with the immigration law is because I think it's significant to look at the size of the population that may benefit from what the Supreme Court did. So moving to DOMA, this was an act back in 1996. And as I said, it went very quickly through the committee in the House, to the House floor, then to committee in the Senate, to the Senate floor, to the President's desk, including a summer recess. And therefore, again, I think if Congress could look at itself, it wants to act, it can do so. And I think that's a lesson we can all try to encourage some of these congressmen who were there then, that they can move on immigration reform as well. Back in 1997, the GAO, the General Accounting Office, figured out that there were 1,949 federal statutory provisions classified in the U.S. Code that were benefits or privileges that you only had as a married couple. And therefore, that has been a very, very significant impediment to same-sex couples who are legally married in the states that I mentioned. And it's only increased over time. Under DOMA, persons in same-sex marriages were not considered married for immigration purposes. U.S. citizens and permanent residents in same-sex marriages could not petition for their spouses nor could they be accompanied by their spouses into the U.S. on the basis of a family or employment-based visa. A non-citizen in such a marriage could not use it as a basis for obtaining a waiver of relief from removal from the United States. Following the end of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military, which was 2011, the Defense Department found itself sort of in a conflicted situation, because on the one hand, they have now been told by Congress that there is no discrimination between gays, lesbians, and transgender in the military, but these military bases are within states. And so as the Defense Department had tried to roll out the equality for all their soldiers and all their employees, they found that certain states were fighting back, saying, no, you can't perform a marriage ceremony here. No, they can't visit themselves, their partners in hospitals that are off base, so on and so forth. So fortunately, with the end of DOMA, the Defense Department has already come out very quickly saying that now, because DOMA is no longer in effect, that no matter what state you're in, most of the rights that go with the Defense Department, that you flow through the Defense Department, are going to be provided to same-sex couples and their children, no matter what base they're on. Now, there are certain federal things that are still restricted, but when it comes to what are rights such as the cohabitation in housing, so families can be together, that has been taken care of. Now, as we know, Obama back in 2008 said he wanted to repeal DOMA, but as you know, he's the president and can't make Congress do things. So in 2011, Eric Holder issued a policy saying that while they will continue to implement DOMA rules throughout the country, this before the Supreme Court this past summer, they said that they would no longer defend it, and saying it was unconstitutional, so they weren't going to defend it in Congress. That sort of has led to where we are, where the Supreme Court in June invalidated Section 3, that one section that said between a man and a woman, which basically was the pedestal of the whole law. So what that has done is now put the federal government, the presidency, the executive branch, in control of all these regulations. And what's happened really since June, you have seen a very quick movement, particularly on the immigration front, by this administration to publicly state, and I think there was a press conference maybe 2 Fridays ago that Kerry held at the head of the State Department, that made it very clear that all of the offices of the immigration offices where you go to petition, where the U.S. citizen may go in to petition for their immigrant spouse, are going to give them the same paperwork that you would be given for the opposite sex couples that have been on for decades. So what we've seen already is several green cards already being issued to same-sex couples because they had prepared their petitions prior to the ruling and got them in right away. And you're seeing that there's a very positive opportunity by this administration. Unlike what Congress is doing with immigration reform, you're seeing very quick action by this administration on trying to level the playing field, if I can use that analogy, so that any binational couple that is married in a jurisdiction where marriage is legal, in the United States, the 13 states I mentioned, and the DC, which is not a state, so that's the 14th, and the 5 Indian tribes, or in a country like Spain, where they were legally married and they come here, that U.S. citizen is be able to move quickly to get a green card. Now, there are a number of barriers, and as you know, opposite-sex couples have barriers. And I have, some typical questions that I could go through right now, or I can wait for questions from the audience. But there are, I have some answers to some specifics regarding whether that person came here with, they were processed, but maybe they are overstay. There's a difference between someone who actually entered the country, was inspected, got the stamp, but they overstayed a certain type of visa. There is a difference for all binational couples, whether they're straight or same-sex, that you have to be aware of. If you came in the country undocumented, you're going to be in the same situation of an undocumented immigrant in a opposite sex straight marriage relationship. So the sort of the easy answer is, if you know what happens with the opposite sex couples, that's going to be the same timeline and the same process. There is one hitch that I've come up with that is sort of interesting, because I think you all who know the immigration services in this process, there is, once you get the green card, there is a 2-year waiting period of having been married before they'll issue the complete green card. They give you a stamp on the green card or some type of process that says this is not a completed process yet. And right now it's a 2-year period. Well, it's unclear. It's like in my situation, we were married in 2008. We've been married more than 2 years.
More than 2 years, yeah.
However, there are some legal scholars who are saying, well, the 2 years don't start until when DOMA ended, which was this past June. So we may not be able to get the full privileges of a green card. However, I think there are a number of lawyers who are talking about this issue, and you may see some court issue or some, movement agency issue on that, because there may be a confusion on when that 2 years actually starts. So I hope I've given you some information, and I'm happy to answer others.
Okay, so this is a segment when you can ask questions. You can direct your questions to, obviously, any one of our 3 presenters. And we have about 15 to 20 minutes for question and answer period. So who wants to be first? There you go.
I have a question. I was working for the TPS, and some of the people who overstay put that they were illegals, and because they said that the people who was doing the TPS form told them that it was better for them to look like an illegal than to look like an overstayed person. Do you know why?
No, TPS, the way it was, the way the statute reads, it's like the executive can provide any national when there has been a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, so
Yeah.
like Syria or Haiti. So it's independent of your status. So you can be here undocumented, or you can be here on a visa. And so if TPS is taken away, you revert back to your previous status. So if you were here as a tourist, you will revert back to tourist, and then when then you would have to leave the country if you don't want to be here undocumented. So there's no reason why someone would have told them that, because for the purpose of obtaining TPS, that has no relevance.
Okay, so they were wrong.
Yes, they were wrong. They should. Because it doesn't really matter. It's now if they were already had overstayed their visa, yes, they were in an undocumented status. But if their visa was still valid, they still could have gone into TPS. That had no relevance to that, because the protection is to the national in the country. That's basically what it does.
Okay, I have lots of those cases. Like, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Back here.
Josue, just concerned about you mentioned UDC and the Dreamers, and have there been any agreements with, let's say, universities in Maryland or Virginia that are allowing
Undocumented youth for DC residents going to outside schools? No, or undocumented youth, if they graduate from DCPS, they have 2 years to enroll to UDC, and it's an administrative process that the administration figures out what they already figured out, that they will allow you to enroll as in-state tuition as long as you graduated from DCPS. Anyone else, let's say not DC residents, undocumented youth that didn't graduate from DCPS, they will be considered out-of-state students and will be charged the out-of-state tuition. Leaving DC, as in many states, they would charge out-of-state tuition for anyone who's not a resident in the state or is not a legal resident under whatever parameters that they may have. In some jurisdictions, we've seen the issue with Maryland that they voted for it, against it, and are back for it, so. Did I answer your question?
Let me just add a little bit sort of to that. So a lot of states have actually approved in-state tuition for undocumented, meaning that, because as undocumented, they see you as an international student, you get the international rate. But that in no way means that you have access to any financing. So the issue of cost is very relevant, because I don't know many families that could afford out of pocket to pay like the University of Maryland or even UDC. I mean, it may be less costly than but it's still very expensive. So undocumented students, even if they're from DC and they still get in-state tuition, they have very little access to financing, and the only financing available is usually private donors or schools themselves sometimes set aside their own funds, not government funds, but their own funds to provide. So the issue of actual access is still a big deal, because even if you have, if you're able to pay in-state tuition, there's no guarantee you could still afford it.
Hector?
I have a two-part question, and everyone's separated. But number one is the detention centers. How can we ensure that the younger people are protected in the detention centers from the older types? I've heard of cases where they have young people put in some prisons, for example, like in Louisiana, with adult prisoners, for example. I've heard cases like that from an immigration attorney, which is outrageous. But so one of my questions is, from all three panelists, is how do you monitor that in your organizations to ensure that there is protection for our young kids? Sometimes they come right across the border alone. The other question deals more with the politics of the movement. I have seen the Latinos carry the brunt of the work on the movement for immigrants' rights. And how do you work with the other immigrants, non-Latino immigrants? Is there cooperation? Is there a consensus?
Abel?
Yeah, in terms of the detention, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest issues. I think that there are players in the movement that are behind the scenes that we don't see. And so remember that a lot of the detention centers are now privatized. They're not centers that are run by ICE. There are private companies that run. And the way ICE works, they pay per head per day. So it becomes a revenue stream for a lot of small little towns that they have maybe an empty, jail, and so it's a way to bring money into their system. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is there are three major companies that run, I think, about 60% of all detentions, and I may be wrong on the actual percentage, but those are very difficult because they're run by private. They're very difficult to actually keep track, and there is an increased amount of abuse in those centers. And remember, because it's federal jurisdictions and they're undocumented, they have less rights, so they don't have a right to attorney. So just for legal counsel to get in there is very difficult, because it's also federal jurisdiction. They could be in Maryland and shipped to Ohio and then shipped it to Seattle. So for just legal provision, it becomes very, very difficult. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest concerns that we have, that on the table there's a lot of money for all this sort of shadow entities that want to make money of the immigrant restructuring. So, I mean, I think for us, it's for us to be vigilant, and sort of the devil's in the details, right? So that's why there's a lot of fighting. Is not, I mean, most Americans, when you look at the statistics, show that they don't mind if the 11 million stay. They want them to pay maybe some fine and have a process, but by and large, they don't want them deported. But what people are fighting right now, and you see, are all of these details about who's getting what in terms, and it's just not the detention center, it's all this other infrastructure that's there. Now, in terms of your second question about do we participate or do we collaborate with other communities? Yes, we do. But the reality is that, Latin Americans make up about over 50% of all immigrants as a whole to the country, legal and undocumented. So yes, we tend to be the face. Actually, out of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this nation, 8 of those are Mexican nationals. So if you want to be more specific, the brunt or the face has been a very Mexican, the country-specific face. But that's just because of the sheer numbers.
Right.
I think in the East Coast, and I grew up here, so I've lived in Chicago for 12 years, and the East Coast has not really seen the wave of Mexican nationals coming in. I think we're beginning to see that. I mean, the DC area right now, Mexican nationals make up the second largest Latino suburb. Still Salvadorans are the largest group, but Mexican nationals are growing, and that's true for a lot of other cities. So I think that as much as we want to bring, our Arab, Asian, immigrant allies, the reality is that just because of the sheer numbers are there, but there is real intentional efforts, not just to make this a Latino, because it's not. The immigrant debate is about all immigrants. It's about Canadians. It's about Pakistanis. It's about Iraqis that are coming here, and it's also about Mexicans and Central Americans that are continue to come. So it's about all immigrants, and we do try our best to include them. But just the sheer numbers, we tend to stick out a little bit.
Right.
Okay, no, this one is for Mr. Grandis. A two-part question here. I always thought that we would end up with a woman president before we ended up with an African American president, and then the Obama phenomenon came in. And I say that because I always thought that we would end up with immigration reform before we ended up the feds recognizing, same-sex benefits for same-sex partners. I wonder, one is for countries that not necessarily have gay marriage allowed, but have some type of, just like DC.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, no, DC now allows same-sex, yeah. But prior to that, one is, would those marriages be recognized under this situation? And the other one is, I know you mentioned that some 40% of the population would be covered based on the numbers you gave, but I also heard that nearly half of the states have written in their constitution that, either banning same-sex marriage or, something of that nature. How would those states be handling the recognition of these federal benefits for same-sex partners when in their constitutions it bans, it says, it prevents them from recognizing it?
Both are actually very excellent questions. When I go back to regarding the first question, regarding, let's say, an immigrant from a country that may have civil union.
Argentina.
May have civil union, may have domestic, something not called marriage. What I have been reading is that the immigration services are going to look at the statute in that country and see how many benefits that are similar to the, let's say, the straight couples in that country. So there's going to be a lot of analysis and examination, but there seems to be, at least in this administration, and once again, this is an administration issue, so if the administration changes in 2016, they could come up with their own set of policies unless Congress adopts them, because these are administrative actions right now, right? So what I'm reading is that there's a very aggressive interest in recognizing relationships and recognizing families. And so if someone can demonstrate that their union, which may not be called a marriage in another country, but their union is similar to what the straight couples in that country benefit from, then it's likely they'll be able to document that. Now, on the second part, I think there are 26 states that have in their constitution that marriage is defined between a man and a woman. What happened in the California decision, which is not the DOMA, there are two major cases. One was DOMA that dealt with what we talked about mostly. The other dealt with what happens in California because of the proposition, Proposition 8, okay? So what the Supreme Court did not do, the Supreme Court did not get into the question of the constitutional rights of same-sex people in California getting married. What they got into was the fact that they said that people were, the courts had already recognized marriage as being fundamental under the U.S. and that state constitution, and that the public could not come and take it away, okay? And what they did is they basically punted by only affirming the decision of the lower court, which was talking about that specific part of what happened in California. So what, in a way, what people are taking away from that ruling is that we need to go back to our state. And if our state says in the state constitution it's between a man and a woman, we need a couple to come forward and challenge in that state that it doesn't meet and comply with the rights of the federal constitution. And so it's going to take a number of years, but quite frankly, it looks like from the language, if another state, let's say Pennsylvania, where I mentioned it's happening right now, if that percolates up, and it may take 2 to 3 years to percolate through the courts, and that the courts send it to the Supreme Court, or the parties send it to the Supreme Court is likely to take the same language it did in June regarding California, saying that there's a fundamental right in our federal constitution for the rights of same-sex parties to be married, because they have lost the equal protection that the opposite-sex couples have. So it's not so much affirming same-sex marriage, but it's looking at the individual's equal protection rights. So it's a little complicated, I guess, but basically what we're going to see is a lot of lawsuits. You're going to see a lot of lawsuits in a lot of states, and maybe at some point it tilts, and these other states see it coming, and they may just throw their hands up and say, it's coming. And we want to avoid the mega cost that the state's going to have to spend. But it's going to be a state-by-state situation.
Thank you. We have a question up here.
I was just wondering about the dreamers, when they get the chance to go to college and stuff like that, when they go through the process of trying to become resident or permanent, do they have to go through that 13-year period